We're a student group, a small student group, in fact a very small student group, that organizes progressive educational activities on campus. This is the start of our fifth series of lectures and discussions and debates on contemporary issues. If you are interested in getting involved in education against oppression and helping us organize our activities, we're always looking for new members and new ideas. We're thinking of doing a film series, for instance, next semester. If you're interested in getting involved, helping with that kind of thing, either speak to me. I'm Phil Gasper. My phone number is on the posters for this talk this evening, so I'm easy to get a hold of. Or to Ben Zeman, and his telephone number is 273-6133. Anybody who has ever attempted to put together a speaker series probably knows that there are fundamental laws of quantum field theory which make it highly improbable that you will manage to complete it at the time that you're supposed to. And though we are putting together a series for this semester, I have not yet finished doing the calendar for that. There will be a series, however, and you should look for the calendar and the announcement of particular talks. Let me just mention our next few meetings. On the 26th of this month, 26th of February, that's a Thursday, Ben Zeman, who has just come back from being a participant on the Great Peace March, is going to give a talk about that, accompanied with a video of the march. And after that meeting, we will in fact be having an organizational gathering. So if you're interested either in the Great Peace March or in education against oppression, come to that one. On the 5th of March, which is again a Thursday, I believe, there will be a panel discussion on recent developments in China. And on the 18th of March, which is a Wednesday, Peter Railton, who is visiting at Cornell from the University of Michigan and is a fellow at the Society for the Humanities, will be giving a talk called Marx and the Ideology of Science. We have several co-sponsors for tonight's talk. KUSLA, November 11th Committee, and the Government Department. KUSLA is the Committee on U.S.-Latin American Relations. They have a table outside. They meet Mondays at 5 o'clock in the Commons Coffee House in Annabelle Taylor. You're welcome to go to those meetings. If you're interested in KUSLA, you'll also be interested in a talk that is coming up on Wednesday, February 11th, 8 o'clock in Lecture Room D in Goldwin-Smith. It's called Guatemala, the Forgotten Crisis, an update on the status of human rights, democracy, and the military in Guatemala. It's been given by Mary Jo Dudley, who is the coordinator of KUSLA and has recently been in Guatemala. The November the 11th committee is the Cornell chapter of United Campuses to Prevent Nuclear War. Their next meeting is Sunday, February 22nd at 8 o'clock in Goldwin-Smith 140. They will be planning activities for the rest of the semester there. The Government Department, I assume you know about. Tonight's speaker, Professor Chomsky, has filmed 3 short commentaries for a local news program, More Than the News. More Than the News airs on Tuesdays at 6 o'clock and at 10 o'clock on Channel 13, and those commentaries are going to be starting not tomorrow but next week, but I recommend that you watch More Than the News every week. The Cornell Coalition for Divestment, which has a table outside, meets Thursdays at 5 o'clock in McGraw 165. They're making a collection outside at the moment because there are legal expenses to defray, $5,000 worth of legal expenses to defray. If you'd like to contribute to that, the collection, whatever, is on the table outside. The Marx-Lenin Institute, your friendly local communists, meet Fridays at 5 o'clock. This Friday, we will be spending our whole meeting talking about the contents of tonight's lecture. So if you would like to participate in a discussion about what you hear this evening, our meeting is on Friday, 5 o'clock in Goldwin-Smith 164. Okay, that's all. The speaker is Professor Noam Chomsky of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Chomsky is one of the major intellectual figures of the 20th century, so he doesn't need very much in the way of introduction from me. To give you some idea of the scope of his activities, I should say that. I think that he is the only ever member of the American Philosophical Association to have been on the official White House enemies list for his activities in opposition to the Vietnam War. Over the past 13 months, he has published no less than 4 books. One of them was a study of U.S. foreign policy with special reference to Central America. Second one was a general introduction to his current views on linguistic theory. A third was a technical monograph in linguistics. And fourth, and most recently, is a short book on terrorism. That's quite a range. It's a particular pleasure to have invited him to come and speak at Cornell this evening and to be introducing him this evening. When I first started trying to arrange a visit by Professor Chomsky, that was in 1985. He's booked long in advance. It was shortly after an incident which I think very few people in Ithaca know about, but is connected with Cornell. In 1985, Professor Chomsky was invited to give a convocation address at the Cornell Medical School in New York City. But students at the medical school started a petition and asked him not to speak because they objected to his views on the Middle East. So Professor Chomsky withdrew from speaking, and unfortunately, the students who were graduating had to listen to President Frank H.T. Rhodes on that occasion. Well, we're all very much luckier tonight, and I'd like to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, the topic I want to discuss is the current, what's called the right turn in U.S. Politics and intellectual culture. And I want to look at it, I want to ask how it relates to more persistent and enduring features of American society over many years. First, let's ask what it is. The right turn is particularly associated with the policies of the Reagan administration, so let's look at them as illustrative of what it refers to. The Reagan administration came into office with 3 essential programs, interrelated. The first was a substantial transfer of resources from the poor to the wealthy, already largely accomplished. The second was an enormous expansion of the power of the state, in particular a substantial increase in the state role in directing the economy. In fact, the growth of the state expenditures relative to gross national product, that's been accelerated more rapidly under Reagan than at any time since the Second World War. The intervention in the economy is in the traditional means by creating a state-guaranteed market for high-technology waste production. It's known as the Pentagon. And that's a way to force the in fact, it's a strict Keynesian system, well understood by American business. It's the way of forcing the public to lower consumption levels so as to subsidize advanced technology, and it's part of the system of public subsidy, private profit called free enterprise in contemporary newspeak. The third program, and incidentally this coincided with other techniques to strengthen the state, at the expense of individual rights, increase of censorship, reduction of access of citizens to the state, and other typical statist programs. Third, associated with this is what's called in newspeak an activist foreign policy. In words, that means intervention, subversion, aggression, international terrorism, and general gangsterism and lawlessness. There have been many examples of this, some of them rather successful. The most successful case, I suppose, was in El Salvador, where the Reagan administration succeeded in organizing a very effective mass slaughter carried out by a U.S. mercenary army, trained, organized, directed, and supplied by the United States. This succeeded in killing well over 60,000 people and creating about 1 million refugees. It succeeded in its primary aim, which was actually described by the Archbishop Romero, just before his assassination, just 7 years ago, when he was pleading with President Carter not to send military aid to the junta. He said that the aid would be used to destroy the people's organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. And since, of course, that was the purpose of the aid, it was sent, and that has very substantially succeeded. A second aspect of the Reagan programs has been the war against Nicaragua, this conducted by a second mercenary army, and accompanied with this we have the disdain for the World Court and the United Nations that's typical of the turn towards lawlessness associated with the administration altogether. This was also quite successful. It has succeeded in killing a fair number of people, not as many as in El Salvador, because in Nicaragua the population has an army to defend itself from the U.S. organized terrorists, whereas in El Salvador the terrorists are the army, and there's virtually no one to defend the population. So they've only killed a few thousand people instead of 60,000. But it has been successful in its primary aim, namely in blocking social reform and preventing what was called the logic of the majority, that is the effort to divert the minuscule resources of this impoverished country, which has been tortured by the United States for 130 years now, to divert those resources to the poor majority. That has been substantially the purpose of reversing those programs by violence has been substantially achieved. A third example of the activist foreign policy is the bombing of Libya last April, the worst single act of international terrorism of 1986. Other examples include the support for South African-backed terrorism in Southern Africa and Israeli terrorism in the Middle East, all programs of trying to keep various parts of the world organized and under control. The slaughter in Guatemala, which was supported with great enthusiasm by the Reagan administration, is another case, also reasonably successful, maybe 75,000 people killed, and the traditional rulers of the country, the oligarchy, the military, and of course the U.S. Corporations that are associated with them are back firmly in control, so that's what we call democracy, and other similar examples. The cases of Guatemala, Honduras, I haven't mentioned others, but Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, those are plainly closely related, and put together, this by far wins the prize for international terrorism for the 1980s. There's nothing that even comes close. Recall that this is international terrorism, that is, it's state terrorism, supported, and in the case of El Salvador and Nicaragua, directed and controlled by a foreign power. Well, in essence, that's the right turn. The transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, the increase in the power of the state and state control of the economy, and a foreign policy directed even more than usual towards aggression and terrorism. A few observations about what the right term is. First, one about what it is not. What it is not is plainly conservatism. In fact, it has nothing whatsoever to do with conservatism. Any true conservative would, like say Robert Taft, would turn over in his grave to see the way the term is being used. It's a kind of reactionary jingoism, or perhaps a kind of fanatic Keynesianism, converting the state into a welfare state, but a welfare state for the rich, with the usual consequences of Keynesian methods gone mad, like a huge deficit and so on and so forth. The move towards an aggressive and violent state and a lawless state, again, has nothing to do with the honorable notion of conservatism, and in fact there are virtually no conservatives in the American political system or in the American ideological system in the press or elsewhere. A second point to make about this right turn is that it's supported by elite groups essentially across the board, across the spectrum. There are tactical disagreements, but that's about what they amount to. In fact, every aspect of the right turn was initiated under the Carter administration. The military budget, which has risen more rapidly than in any peacetime administration in U.S. history, it has actually followed rather closely the projections of the Carter administration. The dismantling of the welfare state measures was proposed by Carter in 1978, couldn't be implemented until after the exploitation of the Iran crisis and the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. The terrorist slaughter in El Salvador was in fact initiated by the Carter administration, as I mentioned, and escalated in sadism and scale by Reagan, but the roots were in 1980. The attack against Nicaragua is actually supported across the board by congressional opinion and by the press, with at most tactical disagreements. There are few exceptions, but very few. So take, say, Michael Barnes, who's probably has been the leading congressional critic of the Contra program. He describes what he calls Reagan's program of democratizing Nicaragua as a noble cause, but he says the Contras are not the way to achieve this noble end. How do we know that the United States is trying to democratize Nicaragua? Well, because the president said so, and since the United States is such a magnificent society, how could it be doing anything else? So the evidence of the facts and of history and so on is irrelevant as usual. And in fact, most of the so-called criticism of the Contra aid program is just that it might harm us. It might not work. It might be costly to the United States. That, incidentally, explains the overwhelming congressional support and media support and liberal support for the slaughter in El Salvador. That was successful. Can't harm us. So therefore, it was perfectly okay. I should mention that the slaughters in El Salvador and Guatemala and the smaller slaughter in Nicaragua, smaller only because, as I said, the population has an army to defend itself from the terrorists organized by the United States. This is not just ordinary killing. It's torture and mutilation and rape and assassination aimed at civilians. In fact, it's killing in the style and even on the scale of Pol Pot, a fact which is difficult for Americans who are insulated from the facts to understand. And this is all part of the general program of international terrorism, escalated undoubtedly by the Reagan administration, but started before. Furthermore, the same is true, incidentally, of the terrorist bombing of Libya, very much applauded by liberal American opinion. So, for example, probably the leading critic of Reagan in the press is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who was very enthusiastic about the bombing, in which about 100 Libyans were killed on what is now tacitly conceded to have been a completely fabricated excuse. Lewis was particularly impressed by the fact that the Reagan administration had appealed to a legal argument, as indeed it had. It introduced an innovation into international law. The official explanation for the bombing was that it was, I'm quoting, it was in self-defense against future attack, literally. And that impressed Lewis, who's a great believer in international law, greatly. I might say that that is novel. I don't know of any precedent for the idea that you can engage in self-defense against future attack. That, for example, is a right that Hitler never claimed, and I won't bother to explore what would happen if other states claimed it. Lewis also went on to explain that the killing of innocent civilians is quite legitimate. In fact, if we didn't do it, there would be no way of deterring terrorists, from which it would follow that it would be entirely legitimate to bomb Washington, aiming at Reagan and Schultz and other terrorist commanders, and that wouldn't be wrong even if many, many civilians were killed, in fact, hundreds of thousands if we consider the retaliation killing scale that the United States accepts. That would be quite legitimate, since otherwise how can terrorists be deterred? But there aren't very many people among American elites who can understand these words, and that tells you something about American intellectual culture, because they're obvious and obviously true if you think. Well, furthermore, just to illustrate the breadth of the spectrum of support for these policies, recall that they're not very different from the policies of the Kennedy administration, which is supposed to be at the opposite spectrum of American politics. The Kennedy administration was committed to two of the three major planks of the Reagan program. That is, the increase of the state program of forced subsidy to high technology industry and regressive fiscal measures to increase investment and so on. And secondly, to what they called in those days counterinsurgency, which is a euphemism for international terrorism. The one policy that the Kennedy administration did not follow was transfer of resources from the poor to the rich. But that essentially reflects the difference in the relative wealth of the United States. It's now, though in absolute terms, a richer country than it was 20 years ago. In relative terms, it is not. It has economic competitors, which it did not have at the time. I'll come back to that. And that explains why the Kennedy Democrats supported with some enthusiasm the Reaganite programs of tearing apart the welfare state and building up the support for advanced industry, the forced public subsidy, whereas the Kennedy administration did not have to undertake those policies. It was possible in those days to pursue grand designs abroad and great societies at home, as Walter Heller put it, Kennedy advisor, but now you can't pursue them both, so the great societies at home have to go by the board. So conclusion from these observations, the Reaganite programs are certainly not conservative, and secondly, they are supported, they do represent an elite consensus over a very broad range. Third point is that they are opposed by the public. If you take a look at the poll results over the last 7 years, you discover that the major programs of the Reagan administration have been strongly opposed by the public. That's true of just about every one of them, and they've been consistently opposed. So, for example, the use of the military spending as compared with social spending, the public has been strongly in favor of social spending as against military spending, and the same is true on just about every other program. For example, with regard to the attack against Nicaragua, public opinion is about 2 to 1 opposed to it, and pretty much the same is true of the programs across the board. Well, this raises certain problems for any state. When you're trying to pursue programs which are opposed by the public, there's a problem for the state, whether it's a formal democracy or totalitarian or whatever, and there's a classic technique for overcoming the problem. The classic technique is to try to frighten the public. If people are afraid, they may be willing to accept programs to which they're opposed on grounds that their existence is threatened if they don't accept these programs. So you must convince the public that they're under attack and that they've got to rally and mobilize. And there's a classic device for that too. You appeal to whoever happens to be the great Satan at the moment and assure the public that the great Satan is attacking you. Now it's the evil empire. In Kennedy's period, it was the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that was, in his words, that was trying to thwart our benevolence throughout the world. So anyway, the Russians are coming. That's the classic device. Other times and other places, other great Satans have been appealed to, but that's the one that works here. Well, that, however, carries some dangers. Confrontations with the evil empire are simply too dangerous. They might hurt us, and we don't want to do that. So what you have to do is find proxies of the evil empire. That is, groups or states that are sufficiently weak and defenseless so that we can attack them and kill plenty of people and so on, but without any threat to us, without any cost to us. And for that reason, the Reagan administration immediately concocted the clever idea of making international terrorism the heart of its foreign policy, the soul of its foreign policy. Anyone who heard that rhetoric in 1981 would know right off that the United States was planning to engage in a major program of international terrorism, as it has been doing. But also, it was quite clear what the meaning of this was. International terrorism means we select what you're going to call terrorist states, sometimes minor bit players in the international world of terrorism in which we're a major leader, and you set them up as proxies of the evil empire, and then you attack them. Libya was perfect for the purpose, especially against the background of anti-Arab racism in the United States, which is really astonishing. It was an easy target. It's weak, it's defenseless. You can set up a confrontation with it just about any time you want. And in fact, the Reagan administration has set up a series of repeated confrontations with Libya, every time on the basis of a fabricated pretext, and it has used it as a way of killing Libyans, about 100 of them last April, since it is a weak and defenseless country, assuming that there'll be plenty of support here, and arousing appropriate jingoist passions at home and ensuring the public that they're very frightened, and it works. So, for example, the tourist industry in Europe was just about ruined last summer when Americans stayed home. in fear of going to European cities where they'd be about maybe 100 times as safe as in any American city because of the threat of Libyan terrorists running around and so on and so forth. Some of these cases have been utterly ludicrous, like the December 1981, they concocted a story of Libyan hitmen roaming the streets of Washington planning to assassinate our leader. But since there's no story so ludicrous that the press won't accept it, that one was accepted, and it worked its magic for a couple of weeks until it was gradually dropped and conceded that it was all fabrication and so on. Well, there have been other cases, Grenada, the PLO, the Sandinistas and so on. It would be hard to convince the American people that they are a threat to its existence. But if they're all tentacles of the evil empire planning to destroy us and strangle us with plenty of missiles behind and a record of horrifying acts and so on, then it becomes somewhat more credible. And then it's possible to frighten the public into submission and to get it to accept policies to which it's very much opposed. And that's been going on. That propaganda campaign has been going on with considerable effectiveness. Now, this right turn among elites did not begin, as I've just mentioned, with the Reagan administration, nor, in fact, with the Carter administration. In fact, it began in the, let's now begin to look at a little of the historical depth. It began in the early 1970s, and it began, in fact, in response to the problems caused by the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War caused two major kinds of problems to the U.S. leadership. One class of problems we might call economic, and the other class is essentially disciplinary. The economic problems had to do with the fact that the Vietnam War turned out to be very costly to the United States and quite beneficial to the enemies of the United States, Europe and Japan, the real rivals, not the rhetorical rivals. They were able to enrich themselves by participating at second level in the destruction of Indochina, whereas the costs primarily accrued to the United States. Now that changed the balance between the United States and its rivals. So prior to 1965, though it's hard to remember those days, the Kennedy administration was concerned about Japan, but it was concerned that Japan did not have a viable economy, and it was concerned with measures that we could take to ensure the viability of the Japanese economy. In 1965, the trade balance with Japan shifted, and you remember what happened in 1965, and it stayed that way, and by now we're not concerned with the viability of the Japanese economy anymore. In fact, in general, more generally, the economic power of the United States declined, it was weakened, and therefore steps had to be taken to remedy this. These steps included measures taken from the early 70s to restore the power of business and the profitability of American business. That included attacks against labor, attacks against social programs, forced public subsidies to the competitive sectors of American industry, meaning increase in the military programs, and so on and so forth. That's one class of problems, and that's part of the right turn. The second class of problems, the disciplinary problems, this came in several varieties. There were, first of all, problems of discipline in the Third World. The Third World was getting out of control. In part, this had to do with the breakup of the Portuguese Empire, which threatened to yield independent states in various parts of the world, in Africa and partially in Asia. That required some measures. And there was also the ferment in Latin America taking place at the same time, which again threatened independence, commitment to social programs, and all of these intolerable things. And furthermore, there were serious problems of discipline at home. The domestic population was also out of control. The Vietnam War contributed to the politicization of American society, to the engagement of large sectors of the population in political action. Women, youth, minorities, and so on and so forth, began to enter the political arena. Now, the naive might call that democracy, or steps towards democracy, but the sophisticated understand that it's not, that it's really a crisis of democracy. That's the term that was used by the Trilateral Commission, a collection of international liberal elites, the group that was around Jimmy Carter. The term that they used in an important publication in 1975 in which they deplored the crisis of democracy, namely the fact that normally passive and apathetic groups, which are marginalized and irrelevant, were beginning to become engaged in political action and trying to form programs and put them on the agenda and so on, plainly a threat to elite control. And the liberal elites therefore concluded reasonably that steps must be taken to return the population to passivity and obedience so that what they call democracy can be maintained. In particular, it was necessary, as they explained, this is an internal document, so they're talking kind of frankly, it's necessary to control the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, referring to universities and schools, and in general to overcome what's called the Vietnam syndrome. That is a disease that spread over much of the population. That's why the word syndrome is used. It refers to the disease of opposition to slaughter and aggression and torture and sympathy for the victims and other dangerous symptoms of that kind. Crucially, it's necessary to eliminate any challenge to elite rule. Now, here we have to note that the term democracy has a technical sense, a kind of an Orwellian sense in American political theology. It refers to a system of elite decision with occasional public ratification, but crucially no public participation or influence, except very much at the margins in forming policy or determining its character. Now that was the disciplinary problem at home, and part of the right turn has been directed to overcoming that. Now, going back a little bit in history, notice that there's nothing novel about this. Every major war of this century has evoked a similar reaction on the part of elite groups. That is, on the part of business, the political elites that are primarily business-based, the corporate media, and the privileged sectors of the intelligentsia generally, who serve as the ideological managers or commissars, we might call them, to be honest. After World War I, during and after World War I, the Wilson administration, also regarded as a liberal progressive administration, and also using the pretext of a completely contrived pretext of a Bolshevik threat, it launched a Red Scare, which succeeded very effectively in deterring the threat of democracy in a true sense and reinforcing democracy in the technical Orwellian sense. It undermined the labor movement, destroyed dissident politics, reinforced corporate power, and it left some real serious institutional remnants, two in particular. One, the public relations industry, a vast propaganda organization and structure which is unknown in any other country and very effective in its task of what it calls in internal documents controlling the public mind. And secondly, the National Political Police, that is the FBI, which masquerades as an anti-crime organization, but in fact has very largely been directed to serving as a political police throughout its history. These are institutional remnants of Wilson's Red Scare, which was quite effective in deterring the threat of democracy at that time. It was also at that time, around the early 1920s, that liberal democratic theorists like Walter Lippmann began to emphasize the importance of what Lippmann called the manufacture of consent, or the engineering of democratic consent, as it's called in the academic social sciences and the public relations industry. This was identified at the time as the essence of democracy. The idea developed in the 20s and the early 30s was that in a state that uses violence to control its own population, you don't have to worry that much about thought control. But in a state where the resources of the state are limited, the resources to coerce by violence are limited, you have to worry about more than behavior. You have to worry about thought. And you therefore, where the voice of the people can be heard, you have to make sure that the voice says the right thing. So you need effective devices of manufacture of consent, of indoctrination and thought control to ensure that people can only think certain thoughts. A totalitarian regime, on the other hand, doesn't care too much what people think since it can control what they do. Those ideas were developed at that time and have been applied with some effectiveness in the United States. World War II led to similar developments. The most familiar one was the phenomenon that is mislabeled McCarthyism. In fact, that was a broad-based effort spearheaded by the public relations industry and by liberal Democrats to overcome the crisis of democracy that was then brewing. And again, it was quite conscious. I should mention that American elites and American business in particular have a very highly developed sense of class consciousness, more so than any other in the world. In 1938, even before the war, the National Association of Manufacturers Board of Directors concluded that, I'm quoting now, the hazard facing industrialists is the newly realized political power of the masses. Unless their thinking is directed, we are definitely headed for adversity, they said. And so you'll notice the Marxist rhetoric, which is very common in internal documents in business groups. They felt that it was necessary to take steps, and steps were taken. Substantial efforts were made to overcome this threat, that is, the newly realized political power of the masses, and this was done with considerable success, long before McCarthy was ever heard of. In 1947, when nobody had heard of Joe McCarthy, the State Department Public Relations Officer, Milton Davis, commented, I'm quoting, that smart public relations has paid off as it has before and will again, and has moved the public opinion climate sharply to the right, anti-social change, anti-economic change, anti-labor, at the same time that the rest of the world, including Europe, had moved in the opposite direction, admitting labor into the government and passing liberalized legislation. I might mention that these developments in the rest of the world caused great concern, and U.S. power was applied to halt them. I probably won't have time to talk about that, but will in the question period if you like. The general point is straightforward. Wars and other periods of turmoil, depressions for example, they tend to get people thinking. They tend to involve people in social and political action, creating a crisis of democracy. That is a threat that there might be meaningful moves towards democracy. And naturally, dominant elites have to rally to defend themselves against this threat to privilege and power to maintain democracy in the technical Orwellian sense, with the public marginalized and elite decision unchallenged. The Red Scare during and after World War I, the post-World War II repression and public relations campaign, and the right turn to the post-Vietnam decade, all of these are examples of the elite reaction to this threat of independent thought and meaningful political action on the part of the population that tends to arise in times of crisis, such as wars. In all of these three cases, a major enemy, the major enemy, in fact, was the domestic population, or the special interests, as they're called in contemporary newspeak. They have to be returned to passivity and obedience and apathy, and in fact, in all three cases, the Bolshevik threat was very effectively used for this purpose. Prior to the Bolshevik threat, when there weren't any Bolsheviks around, there were other threats. So, for example, when Woodrow Wilson, who, as you know, was the great apostle of self-determination, when he celebrated this doctrine of self-determination by invading Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1916, where, incidentally, his warriors murdered and destroyed and eliminated constitutional government and left the countries in a state of ruin from which they have yet to emerge, also leaving them in the hands of U.S. agricultural corporations largely. When he carried out those actions in support of the right of self-determination, he appealed to the threat of the Huns. There were no Bolsheviks around. And if you look back a little bit earlier, say when we were conquering the West from the indigenous population, we were defending ourselves from the British, and we were defending ourselves from Mexico when we stole a third of Mexico after Mexican aggression launched deep inside Mexico, and we defended ourselves from the Spanish for many years, and so on and so forth. In fact, that's a major theme of U.S. history from the earliest days. Other powers, of course, use similar devices. So, for example, the population of the Soviet Union supports what they call the defense of Hungary, the defense of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. They see themselves as acting in defense of those countries, ultimately in self-defense against the evil empire that's intent on destroying them, namely the United States. And in fact, the Cold War is highly functional for the two superpowers, for dominant elites in both groups, offering each of them a way to combat their major enemy, namely the domestic populations, and to keep them under control. This high degree of functional utility of the Cold War for elite groups helps explain why it persists despite the long-term threat to survival. Well, turning back to the current right turn, which is not very novel, as I've tried to illustrate, this massive propaganda effort has been highly successful among elite groups, that is, the educated and articulate part of the population, which typically is the segment of the population that is most deeply indoctrinated and obedient and least aware of the things happening in the world, and most important in a system of, and the most important part of the population in a system of elite rule, which is mislabeled democracy. However, these general policies this time around have been much less successful among the general population. They were very successful after the First World War Red Scare and the Second World War repression, but this time much less so among the general population, as I've indicated. The population remains opposed to the policies of the right turn and remains under the grip of the dread Vietnam syndrome. In fact, popular dissidence has been quite significant, and that has compelled the Reagan administration to resort to indirect forms of international terrorism. So, for example, in El Salvador, it was unable to send U.S. military forces to carry out the slaughter themselves, as in earlier years. It was impossible to do what John F. Kennedy could do quite readily when he attacked South Vietnam in 1962. Then there was no objection. That was the year in which the U.S. Air Force began the large-scale bombing of South Vietnam, bombing and defoliation, the U.S. Air Force, not mercenaries, as part of the program of trying to drive several million people into concentration camps in which they would be separated from the guerrillas, who, as the government conceded, they were willingly supporting. When that aggression against South Vietnam took place, there was no public opposition at all. You can even tell that by the fact that the concept of a U.S. attack against South Vietnam doesn't exist in American history, rather only a defense of South Vietnam, which was unwise, the doves say. And given the cultural hegemony of the United States in the world, the fact that the United States attacked South Vietnam doesn't even exist in world history. But in fact it took place just as much as the Russian invasion of Afghanistan took place, however without any protest and without any objection. Reagan could not do the same thing as his model Kennedy in El Salvador and was forced to resort to indirect means of carrying out the domestic slaughter and terror. In the case of Nicaragua, again, the administration was compelled to resort to covert means instead of direct aggression, as in the case of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam or Lyndon Johnson's dispatch of 23,000 Marines to avert the threat of democracy in the Dominican Republic in 1965, and other operations of the days when all of this could be quite open and overt with no protest. In the case of Nicaragua, the Reagan administration had to develop a shadowy network of CIA subsidiaries and so-called private organizations run by American ex-generals in close coordination with the White House. The United States government under Reagan took over the World Anti-Communist League. That's an organization of death squad killers, torturers, and assassins, fanatic anti-Semites from around the world, with a core of Nazis who had been recruited by the United States in the early post-War II period as part of its program to destroy the anti-fascist resistance in favor often of fascist collaborators, supported by U.S. client states such as Taiwan and South Korea. This was turned into a very effective instrument of international terrorism from Mozambique to Nicaragua. Arms sales to Iran via Israel with Saudi Arabian funding, which were untaken for quite different purposes, which in my view are being concealed in the current so-called exposures. These arms sales were diverted to Contra aid through Swiss banks, along with millions of dollars solicited from, by the State Department from the Sultan of Brunei and other sources, and so on, in ways that you're now familiar with from what you've been reading in the papers. In ways such as this, the Reagan administration constructed an international terror network of impressive sophistication, one which has absolutely no parallel in history to my knowledge, and it used it for a variety of purposes with a good deal of success: to maintain the war against Nicaragua so as to undermine the possibility of social and economic development there, to destroy the popular organizations that threatened to bring meaningful democracy and social reform to El Salvador. Unraveling of this complex web of deceit since last October did become an embarrassment to the terrorist commanders in Washington, who have been forced to pretend that they knew nothing about the programs carried out under their general direction, and these partial exposures may serve to limit their capacity to conduct the programs of international terrorism to which they are dedicated, at least for a period. Now, the scandals that have erupted in late 1986, these are a great tribute to the popular movements that developed in the 1960s and that have not been tamed, despite major efforts by business, government, and intellectual elites in the post-Vietnam period. What they demonstrate is that even in a largely depoliticized society like the United States, with no opposition parties and no opposition press outside of the very narrow business-dominated right-wing consensus, nevertheless, it is possible for popular action to have a significant impact on policy, though quite indirectly, exactly as in the case of the Vietnam War. The point is that if the public had been quiescent, as it was in earlier years, then Reagan could have sent the Marines in the style of Lyndon Johnson, or he could have emulated John F. Kennedy in the manner of his use of the U.S. Air Force to bomb and defoliate South Vietnam, to combat what his administration called internal aggression, another Orwellism over there. However, much to the dismay of U.S. elites, the state is now inhibited in carrying out direct aggression, and the resort to indirect means carries with it inevitable problems, one of them being the danger of exposure, which undermines the rhetorical pose of the ideological system, which is used to pacify the public, in particular the pompous and hypocritical rhetoric about combating terrorism, which is regularly produced by the world's leading terrorist commanders in Washington and their servants in the media and the academic profession and the intellectual community generally. Well, I've talked so far about how elite groups have the elite groups that effectively control the private economy, the state, and the ideological institutions, about how they react to threats to their power and privilege from one primary threat, namely one primary enemy, namely the domestic population. However, there are other enemies that have to be tamed. There's the industrial powers of the first world and their populations. There's the population of the third world. There's the Soviet Union. How have these challenges been addressed? I'm not going to try to review all of modern history, but let me mention a framework. Let's go back to World War II. World War II created a new world order. The United States achieved a position of power and security that probably has no parallel in history. It literally had half the world's wealth. It had no enemies nearby. Other industrial powers had been damaged or destroyed. The U.S. economy grew very rapidly during the Second World War. There was a position of domination that really did have no historical parallel. U.S. planners understood all of that very well, and they were determined to keep things that way. There's an elaborate planning record illustrating this. There was a spectrum of opinion among the planners, of course, in the early post-war period. At the hardline extreme, you have documents like NSC 68, one of the most important documents of post-war history, written by Paul Nitze. It was put out just before the Korean War. It was not a reaction to the Korean War. NSC 68 called for a rollback strategy against the Soviet Union, in its own words, policies to foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system by a variety of means that would enable the United States to negotiate a settlement with the Soviet Union or a successor state or states. That is, we had to break it up and negotiate with successors. This, they said, would require sacrifice and discipline. We would have to overcome the excess of tolerance among us and domestic dissent, that is, overcome democratic politics. They called for a huge increase in the military budget, and so on. This was not idle rhetoric at the time. Covert means being used included, for example, U.S. support with CIA drops of hundreds of agents and supplies for armies fighting inside Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union, in fact, which had been encouraged by Hitler. It included placing West German intelligence in the hands of Reinhard Gehlen, who was in charge of Nazi intelligence operations on the Eastern Front, and so on. Well, that was the hard line. More interesting is the other extreme, the doves, people like, say, George Kennan, who was in charge of the State Department planning staff until 1950 when he was replaced by Nitze, and in fact is one of the major figures in shaping the post-war world, also one of the most humane and intellectual and lucid of state planners, now something of a hero in the anti-war movement. So he expresses the other end of the spectrum. For example, in a policy planning study which he wrote in February 1948, which I'll quote, a section from, which explains his general position. He said, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives, such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better." Well, that's the Doves. This is, of course, a top secret document, and to pacify the public, it's, of course, necessary to trumpet the idealistic slogans in a manner to which you're familiar. These prescriptions, in fact, refer to the Far East, but the United States is a global power, and Kennan, among others, emphasized that the same principles applied elsewhere. In fact, as Professor Lefebvre here has pointed out, in a briefing for Latin American ambassadors in 1950, Kennan observed that a major concern of U.S. foreign policy must be, in his words, the protection of our raw materials. Notice our raw materials. This is internal discussion, so you can be honest about it. He went on to explain the means that we have to use to protect our resources against the people who have funny ideas about them in their own lands. He says, "The final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists." Here we have to introduce another term of newspeak, namely the term communist. The term communist in American political theology has absolutely nothing to do with the political positions of the people so identified. For example, they can be a Bible study group organized by conservative sisters of some Catholic order. They become communists if they meet a very simple criterion. They fall under the heresy that says they're beginning to use our resources for their purposes. That's what makes them communists. And in fact, this is sometimes described with surprising frankness, even in the public record. So, for example, there's an quite important planning document written in 1955 by the National Planning Association and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, directed by William Yandell Elliott, a kind of a Harvard honcho at the time. They defined communism there pretty accurately. They identified the communists as those who transform their economies so that they do not complement the industrial economies of the West. That is, they do not understand that their function is to serve us. That's what are called communists, and we have to support police states, Kennan explained, in order to suppress them. Liberal regimes won't do. I should mention that virtually all of this is excluded from the memoirs, naturally, and also from most of the scholarly literature, including the extensive scholarship on George Kennan, which claims that he had no general geopolitical conceptions except a few banalities. This is true even of people like John Lewis Gaddis, who certainly are aware of the documents, for one thing, since he published them elsewhere, but it's not considered appropriate for your sensitive ears. Well, views such as these illustrate the spectrum of opinion among planners, from the hawks to the doves. If you read through the documentary record, you find that it generally falls within that spectrum, although you can find some qualifications. For example, there was an influential study of April 1947, which observed that aid should be restricted, I'm quoting now, to countries of primary strategic importance to the United States, excepting in those rare instances which present an opportunity for the United States to gain worldwide approbation by an act strikingly humanitarian, in which case the act will provide grist for the mills of the commissars. Well, that's roughly the public record. I would have a choice now between two options. One is to try to illustrate a broad spectrum of the documentary record for which there's no time. The other is to focus on one particular element, so let me pick the latter. some recently declassified documents about Latin America, which are quite typical, incidentally. I've elsewhere written extensively about the documentary record for Southeast Asia and other places, which is quite similar, but let's take a look at this. Particularly, documents from the early 50s are now beginning to come out, and one interesting set has to do with the overthrow of Guatemalan democracy in 1954. Right after that successful achievement, the National Security Council explained the central U.S. objectives in a top-secret memorandum, NSC 5432, entitled U.S. Policy Towards Latin America. It says this replaces an earlier NSC document which was entitled U.S. Policy in the Event of Guatemalan Aggression in Latin America. The idea is that now that U.S. aggression had eliminated the danger of Guatemalan capitalist democracy, it was unnecessary to contemplate ways to respond to the grave threat of Guatemalan aggression, before which the hemisphere had been quaking in terror, just as it's quaking in terror before Nicaraguan aggression today. Here we see illustrated, incidentally, the very traditional device of accusing the target of aggression of being the perpetrator of the planned crime, so that therefore we must attack it in self-defense. For example, as used when Hitler defended Germany against Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939, and many other cases. Nicaragua today is another similar case. Well, with the threat of Guatemalan aggression successfully removed, the United States could return to what the document calls increasing stability and economic development. I'll now quote, crucially encouraging a climate conducive to private investment. The U.S. should encourage the Latin American countries to base their economies on a system of private enterprise, and as essential thereto, to create a political and economic climate conducive to private investment of both domestic and foreign capital, including opportunity to earn, and in the case of foreign capital, meaning ours, to repatriate a reasonable return. Those are quotes. In general, the goal expressed throughout is to foster export-oriented economic development with U.S. corporations firmly in command. The primary concern of U.S. policy is stated rather clearly in the opening words of this crucial document. I'll quote, says there's a trend in Latin America towards nationalistic regimes maintained in large part by appeals to the masses of the population. Concurrently, there's an increasingly popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses, with the result that most Latin American governments are under intense domestic political pressures to increase production and to diversify their economies. Well, plainly, that will never do. Therefore, the U.S. must take what the document calls a realistic and constructive approach, which recognizes, quote, that it is essential to arrest the drift in the area towards radical and nationalistic regimes, namely those which try to do something for their own population. Notice they're called the masses. That's, again, typical Marxist rhetoric, which is very common in U.S. planning documents, just as it is in internal business documents. You can't use the word masses without being thrown out of the department in other contexts. This memorandum goes on to emphasize the need for hemisphere solidarity in support of our world policies, the reduction and elimination of the menace of internal communist or other anti-U.S. subversion. Note that adequate production in Latin America of and access by the United States to raw materials essential to U.S. security, which is a very broad category, and the ultimate standardization of Latin American military organization, training, doctrine, and equipment along U.S. lines. Now, the latter is particularly crucial, since in order to arrest the dangerous trend towards nationalism and concern for the domestic population, it will be necessary for the U.S. to make use of domestic military forces, such as the National Guards, which were established after Marine intervention in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and elsewhere, or the direct use of U.S. force, if these means do not suffice. Notice also that this insistence on individual or collective action against communist or other anti-U.S. subversion in any American state, that doctrine in 1954 anticipates what's called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was enunciated in 1968 by Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev with regard to Eastern Europe, a doctrine which was bitterly condemned as the ultimate proof of the viciousness of the evil empire and its menace to civilization. This same document goes on to outline in some detail the means that should be taken to integrate the Latin American military within the U.S. system. I won't give the details, but except to note that they are directed against two primary enemies of the United States, namely the domestic population, of course, but also Europe, because they're concerned to displace Europe, which at that point had some control over the Latin American military, and we've got to take it over. Well, that was 1954. In 1962, the Kennedy administration made a fateful decision, one of the most important decisions in modern history in terms of its consequences. It shifted effectively the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to what it called internal security, meaning war against their own populations. That was a decision which helped set forth the growth of the spread of national security states modeled basically on the Nazis throughout much of Latin America, with horrifying effects on the population throughout the continent. There's a secret study by Robert McNamara's Pentagon, just recently released, June 11th, 1965, which picks up these themes and tells you how things look after these steps had been taken, after the United States had succeeded in taking over control of the Latin American military and reversing their function so that they're now concerned with internal security. The memorandum is entitled Study of U.S. Policy Towards Latin American Military Forces. Its lesson applies much more widely, and it tells you a lot about U.S. aid to the military in any country. Also tells you something about the arms sales to Iran, if you think it through. This document points out that U.S. policies towards the Latin American military have on the whole been effective in attaining the goals set for them, in particular establishing predominant U.S. military influence and improving internal security capabilities. It goes on to explain that the primary role of these military forces is to protect the sovereignty of their nations, but this obligation has a special meaning in the Latin American cultural environment, namely, I'm quoting, in order to protect the sovereignty of their nations, the Latin American military must be prepared to act to remove government leaders from office whenever, in the judgment of the military, the conduct of these leaders is injurious to the welfare of the nation. Okay, well now remember U.S. military control has been firmly established, and the Latin American military has mastered what they call the understanding of and orientation towards U.S. objectives, so we can be quite confident that the judgment of the military will reflect the preferences of Big Brother as they pursue what the document calls their primary role, in fact, guaranteeing that democracy will function within the limits established by the ruler of the hemisphere. The document also explains, this is McNamara to McGeorge Bundy, former Harvard dean. The document also explains the roots of what it calls the U.S. political interest in Latin America, pretty conventional terms, here they are. Oldest is the military one, which springs from the geographical proximity of Latin America to the continental United States, from the importance of the Panama Canal as a traffic artery, and particularly since the during the World War II period, from the strategic raw materials which the area can supply. Somewhat younger, though possibly stronger, is the economic route, whose central fiber is the $9 billion of private U.S. investment in the area, and the related fact that U.S. trade with Latin America is nearly $7 billion annually. So a major priority, they go on, is to protect and promote American investment and trade, as well as to foster concerted diplomatic action and support of U.S. Cold War positions, while improving the military contribution to internal security. And then they go on to address those tasks in a detailed country-by-country basis. Again, like the earlier document that I mentioned, and characteristically, this one stresses the dangers of what it calls nationalism and neutralism, which might give fresh impetus to endemic anti-Americanism, including rejection of U.S. counsel and interference with U.S. economic interests. Now, the planners, as always, are dedicated Marxists, and they are therefore particularly concerned, I'm quoting, that the contemporary ferment in Latin America is giving rise to a revolutionary struggle for power among major groups which constitute the present class structure. Typical Marxist rhetoric again, and naturally U.S. elites have to position themselves to determine the outcome of this class struggle. In other words, it's standard kind of baby talk Marxism, but with the signs reversed. Hence, the importance of ensuring control over the internal security forces, which they say as a whole are probably the least anti-American of any political group in Latin America. Notice, political group. That's the result of the U.S. policies of attaining predominant influence over this political group. The emphasis throughout is on enabling these forces to preserve order. This is in accord with the policy initiated by the Kennedy administration in 1961 and 1962, which they describe here as the period when the United States began furnishing equipment and training specifically identified for internal security. That, incidentally, is the major contribution of Kennedy liberalism to Latin America. Now, they say there are certain impediments in carrying out our policies. One is the legal systems in Latin American countries, which really are a problem. Why? They require courts to free prisoners without regard for the circumstances of their capture, unless witnesses can testify that they actually saw the accused commit the crime with which he is charged, and that's a problem. And also there is what they call the reluctance of governments to establish bilateral or multilateral arrangements for the control of travelers. That had already been achieved in the United States through legislation to bar so-called subversives from the land of the free, but the Latin American countries were not up to our standards in this respect. However, these handicaps can be overcome, and they were by such methods as disappearance, torture, death squads, and large-scale slaughter under U.S. auspices. I remind you again that State Department Dove George Kennan had observed much earlier that we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government, and that it's better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it's indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists. Well, there's rich documentation of a similar nature for much of the world, and in fact, the general planning conceptions were developed during the Second World War, but there's no time to go through that. Europe, in the world system that the U.S. was attempting to develop at that time, and did succeed to develop, what planners called the Grand Area, a region that they said must be subordinated to the needs of the American economy, the area that they described as strategically necessary for world control, most of the world, all of it if possible. The third world was to be incorporated within it by means such as these. Europe initially posed some problems. However, it's worth noting that Soviet aggression was considered a very remote eventuality. They never expected Soviet aggression, contrary to much propaganda. That's pretty clear now that the documentary record has come forth. The problem was a different one. It was explained by the CIA in 1947. They said the problem was the possibility of economic collapse in Western Europe and the consequent accession to power of communist elements. And that was likely then if democratic politics were allowed to function. In fact, Jan Christian Smuts, who's one of Churchill's major advisors and South African Prime Minister, he explained in 1953 that with politics let loose among these peoples, we may have a wave of wholesale communism. The reason was that of course they're using communist in the usual sense to include radical nationalists or radical Democrats or anything of the sort. The point is that the ideas of radical democracy and nationalism had a lot of prestige in Europe at the time. That was the spearhead of the anti-fascist resistance. And therefore it was necessary to make sure that politics were not let loose among these peoples. That was done with extensive efforts to destroy the anti-fascist resistance, break up the labor unions, and so on and so forth. Also, all of this was one of the reasons for the Marshall Plan, which was also motivated by the needs of U.S. industry for export markets and overseas investment. It was one of the techniques of public subsidy to U.S. industry. Kennan's advice was crucial in developing these programs. It was also followed in Japan with what was called the reverse course in 1947. That was a series of steps initiated pretty much by the State Department that terminated the early steps towards democratization that had been taken under MacArthur's military administration, suppressed unions and other democratic forces, and placed the country firmly under the control of corporate elements that had backed Japanese fascism. That's a system of state and private power that still endures. It was recognized very early on that Japan would become again the industrial center of Asia, and it was also recognized that unless the United States guaranteed for it access to the markets and resources of the region, there was a danger that Japan would move on its own to create a new order with Japan as the center from which the United States was excluded. That concern over that prospect, in fact, had been a factor leading to the Pacific War. Kennan's policy planning staff explained that Southeast Asia must, quote, fulfill its major function as a source of raw materials and a market for Japan and Western Europe. So a lot of the people in Southeast Asia didn't understand that that was their major function, and it was therefore necessary to drill it into them by the usual means. This concept, elaborated at length in the documentary record, that explains the deep concern over the Vietnamese nationalist movement, which it was feared might stimulate dangerous ideas of independence. There was also a related fear that social and economic progress in communist China and in Vietnam might influence others. That's the rational version of the domino theory. So then the State Department concluded in 1959 that the United States must undertake measures to retard the economic progress of the communist Asian states. Those are the considerations that lie at the roots of U.S. aggression in Indochina, as today in Nicaragua and elsewhere repeatedly. The general theory is one that we might call the rotten apple theory, using the rhetoric of Dean Acheson and other planners. The concern is that one rotten apple might infect the barrel, as they put it. As Kissinger put it in the case of Allende, the virus might spread contagion throughout the region. In fact, in the case of Chile, all the way to southern Europe. The virus that might spread, the rot that might spread, is the threat of successful independent development in a system not under U.S. control. It can be capitalist, socialist, anything. That's unacceptable because the rot might spread, leading to the erosion of the U.S.-dominated system of the Grand Area and crucially harming the crucial right to rob and exploit, which is the core principle of U.S. foreign policy. Let me mention in this connection that the United States achieved its major objectives in Indochina. It's worth bearing that in mind. It's virtually impossible for a country with the power and resources of violence of the United States to lose a war against a small enemy, or any enemy, because if the United States does lose a war, that'll be the end of the world. So what happened there is clear. No successes will infect the region. In fact, the countries will be lucky to survive, and post-1975 U.S. policy has been designed to ensure maximal suffering and repression in the countries that were devastated by U.S. violence. For example, support for Pol Pot since certainly 1980, probably 1978. Meanwhile, the United States buttressed what they call the second line of defense. Remember, if you're trying to stop the virus from spreading, you have to kill the virus and inoculate the region, two parallel programs. So you kill the virus by massive bombardment, scorched earth programs, assassination, and so on and so forth, and you inoculate the region by imposing murderous and brutal states, exactly as the United States did, supporting the Suharto takeover in Indonesia with maybe 500,000 killed in a few months in 1965, backing the overthrow of Philippine democracy in 1972, supporting martial law in Korea, South Korea, in 1965 and 1972, and again under Carter in 1980 when Carter explained that the South Koreans are not ready for democracy, supporting repeated military coups to prevent the threat of democracy in Thailand, and so on. The region was inoculated from the virus, and the virus was pretty well destroyed at the core, which did achieve the major U.S. objectives. Well, there's a lot more to say about this. If there were time, I'd like to talk about how well Kennan's precepts were followed. How well have we succeeded in putting aside human rights, democratization, and the raising of the living standards? The answer is quite well. But instead of that, let me finish with a few quick remarks about another phase of U.S. policy, namely security policy in the arms race. Here again, let me begin by saying what security policy is not, and then I'll turn to what it is. What it is not is a policy concerned with U.S. security. The dirty little secret about national security policy is that security has very rarely been even a marginal concern for security planners. That's quite clear when you look at the programs they develop and when you look at the history of the armament system. And if you think it through, it means that virtually all the discussion about this topic, whether by the peace movement or anyone else, is more or less irrelevant. It's important to understand this fact. Security is not a concern of security planners. That's the major point that leaps at you when you look at the history of the arms race and at current weapons programs. So let's take the current situation. Take, say, Reagan's SDI, so-called Star Wars. Notice, incidentally, that that program was initiated without any consultation with the military. The Pentagon was unaware of it. The Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed the NATO command a few days before Reagan's March 1983 Star Wars speech, and they didn't mention this program because it turns out they didn't know about it. In fact, the Pentagon had reviewed a similar proposal earlier and it turned it down as pointless. It was produced for quite other reasons. Now, the Star Wars program, SDI, there is a debate over it. There are the hawks who say maybe it's going to work, and there are the doves who say it's probably not going to work. However, there's something kind of curious about that debate. One thing that's curious is that the doves seem to be on the wrong side. The fact is that the program is dangerous just to the extent that it seems likely to work. Now, in fact, to ask whether it's going to work or not doesn't mean anything. Everybody who's not, technically insane knows that it's not going to work to defend the population against a first strike or anything remotely like that. And even without detailed knowledge of technology, everyone sane knows that highly complex technology, which in the nature of the case is untestable, is not going to work. I mean, that's clear. However, it will possibly work to a limited extent, or at least an adversary must make a worst-case analysis and assume that it might work to a limited extent, meaning it might protect crucial parts of the population and the society, elite elements in particular, against a retaliatory strike, which simply means the adversary must assume that it's a first-strike weapon, quite apart from the fact that those space satellites could very well have offensive missiles and so on them, something which no one will know. Well, what does that mean? What would it mean if the Russians had such a system? It would mean, if they had such a system, that we'd have to build up our offensive military capacity, we'd have to switch over to computerized response strategies, launch on warning and so on, since we might only have a minute or two warning if there appeared to be something happening in those satellites. We'd have to shoot down their satellites at times of crisis because it's just too dangerous. We would have to have pre-delegation of authority to use nuclear weapons to lower junior officers, which already happens to a significant extent in submarines. And in fact, we'd have to take on a series of actions which would raise very substantially the likelihood of nuclear war just by accident or by misinterpretation of miscalculation and misjudgment in times of crisis and so on. Now, we're forcing the Russians to do that to the extent that this system seems likely to work. Their systems are a lot worse than ours. We know that our computerized response systems have repeatedly failed and been aborted by human intervention. Theirs are going to fail far more because their technological level is far lower, imposing an enormous threat to us. The threat of attack against us by inadvertence, error, miscalculation in times of crisis, or simply lack of, fear over lack of time to respond. So what we're doing is driving them to destroy us. We're trying to make it inevitable that they destroy us. That's true to the extent that the program seems to work. Furthermore, at the same time, and so other U.S. current weapons programs have exactly the same consequences. Trident D5 missiles, which are highly accurate and deadly against hard targets, have exactly the same consequences. Furthermore, at the same time that we're developing, we claim, most of this is in the world of fantasy, I should say, because these systems are outlandish, but let's proceed with the fantasies. While we're developing a so-called ballistic missile defense program, we're also not only designing but deploying and leading the race in deploying systems which will render them unusable. If you're serious about ballistic missile defense, note again, this is all in the realm of fantasy, but if you're serious about ballistic missile defense, you've got to ensure the cooperation of the adversary, plainly. That means you've got to have very effective arms control, just what we're trying to undermine. And crucially, you have to ensure that the adversary doesn't deploy means that will circumvent the system, like cruise missiles, in particular sea-launched cruise missiles. They're a deadly danger to the United States because we have long coastlines with most of the population along the coast, not much of a threat to the Russians just because of geography. And in fact, sea-launched cruise missiles will render even a perfect ballistic missile defense entirely irrelevant. Well, the Russians have called for a termination of the development of sea-launched cruise missiles, and we've refused. In fact, we're deploying hundreds of them right now, therefore guaranteeing that the Soviet Union will follow a couple of years down the road, and therefore pose an enormous threat to us. A number of strategic analysts have pointed out that this seems totally irrational, and it would if security were a concern of security planners. But it's not. And in fact, just as these present weapon systems demonstrate that, so does the whole history of the arms race. I won't run through it, but think it through sometime. Take the early 1950s. The United States had no enemies in the hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled most of the opposite side of both oceans. Again, there has never been such a period of security for any state in world history. There was a threat potential at that time. The threat was intercontinental ballistic missiles with highly destructive, meaning hydrogen bomb warheads. So if security had been, say, a marginal concern of security planners, you would find that they had tried to arrest the development of the only weapons that might potentially threaten us. And there was, in fact, plenty of time. The Russians didn't have a really effective ICBM capacity for about 20 years. Well, you take a look at the public record, and as far as I can detect, there is no evidence of any concern over this question, no plans, not even any concern. Didn't seem to cross anybody's mind, and it's not very sophisticated. This is kindergarten level thinking. And that, again, means that security just wasn't a concern of security planners. You take a look at the points of escalation of the arms race, the obvious thing to look at, and you find exactly the same thing. Each point of rapid escalation of the military system was justified by a completely fabricated excuse. Furthermore, it was continued when that excuse was conceded to be a fabrication. So, for example, the current Carter-Reagan expansion was motivated by a so-called window of vulnerability, which was conceded by the administration to be a fraud, but the arms race went on. The Kennedy, the one right before it, the Kennedy military buildup, which set off the current phase of the arms race, that was justified by a so-called missile gap. Now, Eisenhower had pointed out in the 1960 campaign that there wasn't any missile gap, and the Kennedy administration planners certainly found that out within a few weeks after they got into office, if they hadn't known it before. Or to be precise, there was a missile gap. It was about 10-1 in our favor at the time. The Russians had 4 operational missiles, which were at the time exposed. How did the Kennedy administration react to the discovery that there was no missile gap, or rather that it was strongly in our favor? They continued with the military buildup. It was justified by the missile gap anyway. In fact, this is explained by McGeorge Bundy in a secret memorandum in which he says that the term missile gap is a useful shorthand device to describe our basic military posture of enormously expanding the strategic weapon system, so let's keep it anyway, even though there's no missile gap. In other words, pure fraud. As to the first major military buildup around 1950, that was justified at the time as a response to Russian aggression in Korea. 2 small problems with that. One is that the plans were initiated prior to the Korean War, as I mentioned earlier. Second, so they couldn't have been motivated by the Korean War. Secondly, there was no evidence then, nor is there now, that the Russians had anything to do with the North Korean attack. Quite apart from that, the background of the Korean War is rather different than the way it's told us, but this is sufficient to indicate that that excuse was also fabricated. Well, when you have to fabricate excuses for military buildups, and you continue them even when the excuses are conceded to be a fabrication, obviously something else is going on, not security. And in fact, every aspect of the arms race that you look at shows exactly this. The refusal of the United States to enter into a comprehensive test ban, certainly feasible. In fact, the Russians have been begging us to do it for over a year. Supported overwhelmingly by domestic opinion, supported overwhelmingly by world opinion. The United States is usually voting alone against it at the United Nations. So completely feasible, verifiable, as well-qualified experts have pointed out. Why don't we do it? Well, the administration has an argument. Their reason is that if we stop testing nuclear weapons, that will reduce the credibility, the reliability of our weapon systems. Of course, it'll have the same effect on Russian weapon systems. But that's exactly what we should love. We should love a system that reduces the reliability of weapon systems. Why? Because it deters a first strike. A first strike, again, in the realm of fantasy, requires, because the whole business is, I stress that again, a first strike requires high degree of reliability for weapons. You've got to be sure that everything works like a charm if you want to carry off a first strike. On the other hand, a deterrent requires no faith in the reliability of the weapons. I mean, if 2% of them go off, that's more than enough of a deterrent. So if the administration argument is correct, they ought to be pleading for a comprehensive test ban, since it will achieve just what Star Wars is theoretically supposed to achieve, namely protection against a first strike, and it'll be costless, verifiable, and so on. Perfect. In fact, there's debate about whether the argument is correct, but the fact of the matter is that a ban on nuclear weapons tests and also missile tests will no doubt over time, erode confidence in weapons system. Everybody's more or less agreed on that. And that will, in fact, deter the threat of a first strike in a costless, cheap, and effective fashion while maintaining a deterrent. But we're not interested because we're not concerned with security. And the same is true of the whole batch of proposals that the Russians have on the table right now, many of which have barely been reported or not reported at all in the United States, such as steps to dismantle NATO and the Warsaw Pact, to withdraw the fleets from the Mediterranean, and so on. We don't want any of those things, though they would be greatly beneficial to American security. Well, without proceeding, what's going on? If security is not a concern of security planners, what is? In the first two things, actually. In the first place, there is some element of truth to the defensive rhetoric. That is, we must defend the grand area, we must defend our resources, and we must defend them against their own populations, the primary enemy. That means U.S. military forces must be prepared to intervene worldwide, either U.S. military forces directly, or the forces of client and mercenary states, or simply the mercenary forces that we create in other countries. We must be able to carry out these worldwide programs of international terrorism and aggression. Now, the United States is a global empire. Our forces have to be prepared to intervene anywhere, even in areas where they don't have conventional military superiority. And that means we need an intimidating posture. We have to be able to we do have to deter something. We have to deter anyone who threatens to block our aggression, subversion, terrorism in their countries, or any other country that might try to give support for people we're attacking. I should say that this is stated pretty openly in public documents in this case. So, for example, Harold Brown, who was President Carter's last Secretary of Defense, in his last presentation to Congress of the military budget, he explained why we need strategic capabilities. He said, with our strategic nuclear forces in place, our other forces become meaningful instruments of military and political power. That's just what I said, put in their terms. At exactly the same time, just about, Eugene Rostow, who was the Reagan's first arms negotiations advisor, that is, advisor on how to avoid arms negotiations, he explained in the public documents again in 1979 that our nuclear forces provide a nuclear guarantee for our interests in many parts of the world and make it possible for us to defend these interests by diplomacy or the use of theater military force. They provide a shield for us to pursue our global interests by conventional means or theater forces. That means by intervention, subversion, client and mercenary states, and so on. And that's a good reason. That's a good reason for maintaining strategic weapons, so that we have an intimidating posture throughout the world which provides what they call a nuclear umbrella. This idea goes way back in the planning record. You can also find it in the secret documents I won't illustrate. And that's one reason why we need the military system. It has nothing to do with U.S. security, but it has security to advanced sectors of industry. This is something that started during World War II, when corporate managers went to Washington and learned the lesson of Keynes, not because they read Keynes, but because they saw what happened. They learned that massive state control of the economy, massive state intervention in the economy, could overcome the crisis of capitalism. This was particularly dramatic because the New Deal measures had almost completely failed. But the massive control, the establishment of a basically totalitarian state command economy during the Second World War, that worked, and industrial production increased. They learned the lesson. And from that point on, they were committed. They recognized that capitalism is a historical anachronism. It's finished. And from now on, we have a powerful state carrying out industrial management and serving to maintain advanced sectors of industry, the part where U.S. is competitive. Now, how do you do it? There was a debate in the late 40s. It was recognized, as economists tell you, that you could do it through social welfare spending and all sorts of other things. But the problem is that that doesn't meet the primary need, which is to preserve the rights and power of private business. All sorts of other measures you can imagine that the economists point out to you are quite feasible have the property that they mobilize other segments of the society, they redistribute income, they engage people in social planning, they interfere with the prerogatives of management. In fact, in general, they induce a crisis of democracy and so on, and therefore they're out. The military system, as was pointed out in the business press quite clearly in the late 40s, is not like that. The military system is just a gift to advanced industry. It's a publicly subsidized, state-guaranteed market that they can use for waste production. It means that the public will pay the costly phase of research and development, then the profits will be privatized. And it's a cushion that corporate managers can use. When they can sell to the private market, they'll do it. They can appeal to this cushion when they don't have to do it. It's perfect from the point of view of a Keynesian technique for maintaining the state capitalist system, but also the needs and prerogatives of the private forces that own it. It's a way of forcing the public to subsidize wealth and profit. And in that respect, it's perfect. Take SDI expenditures. You want to understand SDI, Star Wars, take a look at a study done by the OECD, the European Economic Community, which points out that SDI expenditures match very closely the expenditures, the distribution of expenses organized by Japan's state-controlled economy, which the United States is unable to duplicate for a variety of social and historical reasons. SDI also has the very useful effect of spurring the arms race, as well as subsidizing high-tech industry and therefore making sure that the system is perpetuated. Notice that this is not a matter of military industry, as is commonly stated. Take, say, computers, the core of a modern industrial economy. In the 1950s, when computers were not marketable, they were 100% purchased by the government. That means the taxpayer, which means that the taxpayer, through the Pentagon, supported the research and development. When computers became saleable on the market, they were handed over to private enterprise to privatize the profits. Currently, we're engaged in the development of so-called fifth-generation computers, very costly procedure of research and development. Plainly, business doesn't want to pay it. They'd rather have the taxpayer pay it, and we are, through the military system. It's in fact 100% funded, the fifth-generation project, through the Pentagon and NASA, which is just an adjunct of the Pentagon, and the Department of Energy, the producer of nuclear weapons. And this is very typical for most aspects of advanced technology. Well, sometimes it's argued that this kind of planning is lunatic, which is perfectly true, but also totally irrelevant. The point is that in government, as in business, planning is short range. The long term is someone else's concern. And this is quite natural, quite rational, in fact, in a competitive society where those who do not devote themselves to short-term advantages are not going to be in the competition when the long run comes along. So we should not be at all surprised at any of the things that I've mentioned. They're completely rational within the framework of short-term advantage, and the fact that they lead to long-term suicide is essentially an irrelevance for planning. So the public may express overwhelming support for a nuclear freeze and for cuts in military and social spending as it does, but this is an irrelevance, as is the clear feasibility of a nuclear freeze, a comprehensive test ban on missile testing, and many other measures that would enhance the possibilities of survival. The public has very little voice in such matters, and public opinion is of no more concern to elite groups that control the state apparatus than security, survival, human rights, the raising of the living standards, democratization, and other noble slogans. This is not because the leadership are bad people, and in fact very little is likely to change if so-called better people take their place. The reasons are institutional, and the problems have to be confronted without illusions, with understanding of the social realities, with a good deal of persistence and courage and dedication among people who hope to survive any of this. You want me to, why don't we just all, would the people who are leaving mind doing it quietly so we can hear? Thanks. Go ahead.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you for being here. I think you're great.
Thanks.
The question, or actually just the thought, is there's going to be a show called America, which will be airing, I believe, February 15th. And I thought maybe we can hear, just a thought about how you feel about it. Because my feelings about it is the whole, the whole Reagan mentality, or the whole institutional, actually, I should say, mentality, right-wing mentality, and they're just, it's just reaching, to the point where they're just trying everything. It's very obvious, but you know, I feel there's a lot of people out there who just,
Yeah.
you know, are not awakened to what we heard tonight, that they fall for what Reagan is saying, and I'm very afraid about this show.
Well, I haven't seen the show, of course, although I was the ABC offered to show me a preview of it. I was, however, interviewed, and, you know, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you may find 15 seconds of it on the air somewhere. I had about an hour interview with the producer there in order to show how, you know, broad-minded they are and so on. They're interviewing quite a range of people about the show, and they say they're going to show tiny excerpts of this. They say they're going to show excerpts. They will be, if anything, tiny and misleading excerpts. But when they asked me what I thought about, I didn't want to bother viewing it. It sounded like a waste of time. So I wouldn't comment on the show itself. But on the general idea, which was clear enough, the main suggestion that they asked me one question on the interview. They said that the main focus on the show as they saw it, they said it was misunderstood. It wasn't anti-Russian propaganda or jingoist propaganda. It was rather a kind of an in-depth study of how people act under military occupation, kind of a profound psychological inquiry into this topic. And they asked me how I thought Americans would react. Suppose we were under, say, Soviet occupation, how did I think various sectors of the population would respond? And on the basis of historical evidence, and I told them the answer on the basis of my own reading of the historical evidence. Namely, you would have the Ronald Reagans reading the ads for the occupiers, and you would have the people who dissent and protest today dissenting and protesting then. That's probably what you'd have. But then when they asked me what my general objection to the show was, and I had obviously indicated I did have an objection, I said that I thought if they wanted to study this problem, there was a much more obvious way of doing it. They could study what the Soviet Union would be like under American occupation. The reason is that we actually have plans, and have had plans since the late 1940s, and probably today. We don't have the current documents. We have had plans to break up the Soviet Union and occupy it and make an agreement with successor states, and we tried to implement those plans, at least up to the early 1950s, supporting Hitler's armies in the Carpathian Mountains and elsewhere. So since we actually had those programs, in fact, we might ask how Americans might react to the discovery of armies in the Rockies supported by the Russians established by Hitler. We might think take that with some discomfort. But since these programs really exist, that's the obvious thing to study. Since they're not just studying that one, it's plainly cheap propaganda. I think it's also a good occasion for educational efforts. I think, you know, it will reach a lot of people. They say, I think, 50 million people or something, which means that people are concerned about the impact of this kind of cheap propaganda, cheap chauvinist propaganda, do have an opportunity to contact and reach people and try to educate them about it. So I don't think it should be abandoned. I think it's an opportunity. Well,
I was quite struck by one thing you said, the selling of weapons to Iran via Israel, financed by Saudi Arabia, you said was carried on for a quite different purpose.
Yeah. What was the purpose? Well, if we want to know the purpose of the arms sales to Iran through Israel, the claimed purpose, you remember, is to establish contact with what are called Iranian moderates and to deal with hostages. So you want to test that out. An obvious question to ask is, what were we doing before there were any hostages? That would serve to test the question whether the hostages are, say, a factor in the selling of arms to Iran via Israel. Well, that's an easy one to answer. There were no hostages in 1981 and 1982, so what were we doing then? Well, the answer is we were selling arms to Iran via Israel. In fact, that was completely public. The pretense of the media that they're surprised by all of this is a total fraud. The New York Times, for example, had a front-page article in, I think, March 1982, written by Leslie Gelb, who's now their managing editor, and I presume didn't forget it, in which he stated that half the arms to Iran are going from Israel, and that of the other half, they're going from private arms dealers, most of whom probably have secret contacts with Israel. Now, arms from Israel means U.S. sale of arms. They make whatever pretense they like, but the relations of dependence between Israel and the United States are such that Israel does things like that with U.S. authorization or not at all. So the fact is that, and there's plenty of other evidence for this. Moshe Ahrens, Israel's ambassador to the United States, in October 1982 had an interview with the Boston Globe in which he stated that Israel was sending arms to Iran in coordination with, I'm quoting, in coordination with the U.S. government at almost the highest of levels. And the point was, he said, to ensure that we would be in a position to either carry off a military coup in Iran or to be in a proper position to take over the successor role after Khomeini. Furthermore, the Israelis were completely open about this, as were high-level American officials. Incidentally, a lot of this stuff is discussed in a book of mine which came out in 1983, Fateful Triangle it's called, and if you have it around page 457, there's some discussion of this from the public record. I got a good memory for things like that. This remembers before there were any hostages, none of this stuff. So, for example, in an hour-long program over the BBC, which I quoted at some length, which here they interviewed, devoted to this topic. This is February 1982. They interviewed top high-level Israeli officials and also high-level Americans. The Israelis who they interviewed are exactly the ones who are now identified as being right at the center of this arms trade. David Kimchi, who was the head of the Foreign Office, Yaakov Nimrodi, they call a private businessman. He was actually the Israeli military attaché in Iran, which means an agent of the Mossad. Uri Lubrani, who was the last Israeli ambassador to Iran, and so on. And these guys are perfectly straight. They say, of course we're selling arms to Iran. The purpose, as Lubrani put it, is to find military officers who are willing to kill 10,000 people and carry off a military coup which will restore the relation under the Shah. That's what we call moderates. If you think that I'm exaggerating, in the press here, people like General Suharto are called moderates. For example, Suharto was called a moderate in the Christian Science Monitor just 2 days ago, and this is standard. Why is Suharto a moderate? Well, because he successfully slaughtered 700,000 people or so in a few months in an operation which was widely applauded in the United States, in particular by American liberals, because it succeeded in doing exactly what we're trying to do in Iran. Namely, it overthrew a government with which we had hostile relations. Now, that's an interesting model. There's nothing new about what we're doing in Iran. In the case of Suharto, the United States was very hostile to the government that preceded, the Sukarno government, so hostile, in fact, that we launched an invasion from the Philippines with mercenaries in 1958, and in fact, U.S. pilots flying for the CIA, one of them was shot down in supporting that attack. We tried to overthrow the regime with a coup. That didn't work. We then continued to send arms to Indonesia. Throughout the whole period of building hostility, we sent arms to Indonesia. Nobody could understand this. But it paid dividends, as Robert McNamara later said in the Senate testimony. It paid dividends in his words, namely with the Suharto coup, pro-American coup, which led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, and destroyed the only mass-based political party, thus overcoming the crisis of democracy, and inoculated that part of the world from the virus that was threatening of independence there. Well, that's not the only case. Take Chile. We were very hostile to the Allende government, but we continued to fund the military, and that too paid dividends. We got Pinochet, another moderate, and we immediately supported him. And in fact, that's why you fund the military. You fund them so as to maintain control for exactly the reasons that I described in that document, on the secret document on U.S. relations with the Latin American military. You fund the military so that you can maintain predominant influence, and you can find at least elements who will understand things in the terms of the associates from whom they're getting arms and training and supplies. And when it's a hostile government, when it's a client government, you hope that the military will perform their function. Remember what that is, to overthrow civilians if in the judgment of the military, which conforms to our judgment, they don't serve the interests of the nation. And if it's a hostile government, you fund the military so that they'll carry out a bloody military coup like Pinochet or Suharto or whoever they're looking for in Iran. Absolutely typical. In that very same BBC program where the Israeli officials, exactly the ones who are now identified, so not new people, where they made it very clear that that was their intent, a number of high-level American officials were interviewed. For example, Richard Helms, former head of the CIA and former ambassador to Iran. He was asked what he thought about all of this, and he said, well, he's not in the CIA now, but he assumes that that's exactly what the CIA is doing. At least that's the obvious thing for them to do. They have to try to find assets, moderates, who will be able to carry out a military coup. Robert Comer was interviewed. He's an old Defense Department official who was involved in the Phoenix program and other nice operations in Vietnam, major war criminal, in fact, and high in the Pentagon in Carter's administration. He was one of the guys who organized the Rapid Deployment Force, now called the Central Command. That's a big military intervention force aimed at the Middle East. And he said he thought this was a good idea, and in fact that he said, well, we can't invade to establish a new government, but if a military coup takes place, we can use the Rapid Deployment Force to support it, namely to defend it against the population. So that's a technique we might have in mind. Edward Luttwak, who's another well-known strategist, so-called, he was interviewed and he said, yeah, I mean, he was a little skeptical about whether we could do it, but obviously the right thing. William Sullivan, another ambassador to Iran, was interviewed. He said, had no objection to it, but he said it's going to cause carnage, total carnage, not just 10,000 people killed. But those are the considerations. Can we get away with it? Now, this was going on before there were any hostages. The term moderates is just more Orwell. They're moderates in the same sense in which Suharto is a moderate. They follow orders. That makes them a moderate. In fact, this was more or less revealed in a secret Israeli government document that surfaced just yesterday. It's today, Monday. Yeah, yesterday in the Washington Post, in a story by this is Amiram Nir, who's Paris's anti-terrorism expert, so-called, and the memorandums, which was handed to George Bush a long time ago, it just surfaced, said that we're not dealing with moderates, we're dealing with the most radical elements in Iran, meaning the most brutal and vicious. And that makes sense. Those are the Suhartos and the Pinochets. That's who you want to be in touch with and in control of. And the purpose, he said, was to ensure our position in the post-Khomeini succession. So I assume that that's been the purpose all along. No reason to believe that any policy's changed since the early 1980s. And it makes a certain sense. It makes a certain sense in terms of a sufficiently, if you assume a state sufficiently committed to violence and massacre, and there's no reason not to make that assumption in the light of history, that's exactly the sensible program. We probably started it off right after the Khomeini revolution. In fact, in February 1979, before Khomeini was even in, but after the Shah had left, Carter sent top NATO general Robert Heuser to Iran, apparently with the purpose of trying to stimulate a military coup. We don't know that for certain, but that seems to be the case. And he apparently couldn't get the Iranian generals to carry it off. And I think if the truth of this matter ever comes out, we'll find that from that point on, the United States simply followed the classic pattern, trying to find military officers who would act in the way that we describe in secret documents, like the one I read, and will in fact carry off some kind of a bloody coup, Carnot, Suharto, and Pinochet style, and restore the friendly relations that existed under the Shah. I imagine that's the true story. At least that's what the evidence points to.
Paul Goodman, who certainly would advocate transferring wealth from the poor to the rich, wrote that he would prefer that his daughter sing "America the Beautiful" and even pledge allegiance to the American flag at public schools than always learn to despise or desecrate the United States in certain alternative schools. And I'm curious about what you think about that and also what you like about the United States.
Well, it depends what you mean by the United States. If you mean by the United States, this is the people. Well, here you got to be a little careful. The country that we live, that refers to a lot of different things. Yeah, it refers to the population, to cultural forms, to social relations, all sorts of things. And in fact, there are a lot of good things here, very good things. For example, in the notice that I talked about the success of popular movements in indirectly influencing decisions in a society that has virtually nothing in the way of politics. Well, why was that success achieved? Success was achieved because of something that's in fact very good about the United States, which I mentioned, in fact, namely that the state is quite limited in its capacity to coerce its citizens by force. Not zero, but limited. In particular, the more privileged elements of the population, like us, I assume most of you, certainly me, those segments are pretty much by relative standards, by world standards, are relatively free from state violence. That's exactly why people like Walter Lippmann and Harold Lasswell and the public relations industry and so on emphasize the need for thought control in the passages I referred to. They emphasize that the United States needs commissars, people like most of us, you know. It needs an intellectual elite. It needs institutions for the indoctrination of the young, as the liberals put it, because it doesn't have resources of violence to use against its own population. Well, those are good things about the United States. Also, the U.S. government, the state, despite the efforts of Reaganite statist fanatics to strengthen the state and weaken the rights of citizens, despite those efforts, the United States still remains rather, you know, in the spectrum of existing societies at the libertarian end in the ability of the population to gain access to information about the government. That's why I'm able to quote those documents, right? Because we're relatively free in that respect. There's also one of the best things about the United States, you find out as soon as you leave elite educated circles, namely the Vietnam syndrome exists. That's very important. It exists among the general population. Here's a good thing about the United States. When the polls ask, what is your attitude toward the Vietnam War? In particular, do you think, I'm quoting, do you think it was a mistake or was it fundamentally wrong and immoral? When that question is asked, 72% of the population says it was not a mistake, it is fundamentally wrong and immoral. That answer is given by 40% of the people called opinion leaders, meaning clergy and so on, and it's given by virtually none of the educated intellectuals and was not given by them even at the height of protest against the war. So among the commissars, that is the educated elite, it is virtually 100% always has been held that it's a mistake, but the population happens to have a much higher moral and intellectual level and says, no, it wasn't a mistake, it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. Okay, those are all very good things about American society. There are also plenty of bad things.
In the political context, you could say, what furthers that type of good thing?
What furthers that type of good thing is that many things. One thing is that there has always been a strongly libertarian strain in American culture, an individualist strain, opposition to state power. Now, elites have tried very hard to destroy it, and for long periods they have, but it continues to rise. Another thing that strengthens some of these factors, here the situation really becomes complex, so you got to think about it. Though the United States is of course not a capitalist society, and everyone knows that a capitalist society couldn't possibly exist for a minute, business foremost, they were strongly opposed to capitalism a century ago for good reasons and insisted on state intervention and regulation of markets and protection of their interests and so on. The United States has always been highly protectionist, and business wants a strong state and always has. Nevertheless, in the spectrum of world societies, the United States is towards the, sort of if you spread them, the United States is kind of towards the capitalist extreme. Now, in a capitalist society, we're very far from being there, and as I say, such a society could not exist for a week. But we're towards that end, and in a capitalist society, everything tends to become a commodity, that is, for sale, people, for instance. Freedom also tends to become a commodity, meaning you can have as much of it as you can buy. And there are certain groups who benefit from that, namely the rich. The rich benefit from, the more freedom there is, the more the rich benefit, because they can purchase more of it. For the poor, it doesn't mean much, it's formal. This is quite a meaningful thing. For somebody like me, say, like when I was on the enemies list, or when I was arrested, or something like that, I could appeal to the formal freedoms that exist, because I'm part of the privileged elite, like us. And therefore I could get a good lawyer and, do all that business. If I was, say, Fred Hampton, a Black Panther organizer in the ghetto, who the National Political Police arranged to have assassinated by the Chicago police, I couldn't. Formal freedoms don't mean a damn thing. I couldn't appeal to them because I would then not be part of the privileged elite. But the point is that the freedom, which largely benefits the wealthy and the privileged, is going to be defended by the people who benefit from it. And since they are the people who happen to run the place, they're going to defend the freedoms. And that means that the rest of us also benefit from them. So in a complex and indirect way, we do end up having a large measure of freedom from state coercion, precisely because that benefits the people who can purchase it, the rich and the powerful who run the private society and the state, and that means the rest of us benefit. And in a very wealthy society like the United States, that includes pretty large sectors of the population. So these are also factors. And so, like anything in the world, it's complicated when you look at it.
Just 2 points. On your last visit to Cornell, which I believe was in 1980, you gave what turned out to be a very accurate prediction of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And I wondered if you'd like to play Jimmy the Greek for us again with his prediction of the invasion of Nicaragua.
Of Nicaragua?
Yeah, the second point.
I thought you were going to say invasion of Syria, but...
The second point is, if I follow your train of logic properly, you describe a line of thought about a system of imperialism, of domestic repression, and state intervention in the economy in terms of military spending, which basically, if you put it in ABC Marxist terms, appears to be responsible for what might be called the crisis of overproduction. And I'm wondering if I'm following your logic correctly, is that the central tenet of this, or central raison d'etre for this system? And if so, what are the methods for combating that?
Well, as for the invasion of Nicaragua, my feeling up until recently was that they were not going to invade Nicaragua, contrary to most of my friends. And my reasons for believing this were on the assumption that they're rather rational. Again, contrary to a lot of people, I think that the Reagan administration, not Reagan, who probably doesn't even know what the policies are, but the people who are making policy have been, which tells you something about American democracy, incidentally, but the people who are making policy have been quite sophisticated, and they've carried out an impressive and successful series of international terrorist operations and programs of turning the state into a welfare state for the rich, and so on and so forth. And on rational grounds, it would be a mistake to invade Nicaragua. The reason is it would be costly to elite interests. And the program that they're following ought to work in the long run. I mean, Nicaragua is a tiny country. I mean, you know, an invisible country. It's possible to, and the United States is a huge, violent superpower. Therefore, it's possible to develop, I mean, we can we can purchase a mercenary army with our power and wealth that can harass and torture and maim and kill and mutilate in Nicaragua forever, maybe at a low level of intensity, but enough to ensure that the government cannot carry out the programs of social reform. And that's our primary commitment. Incidentally, administration officials concede this. You look at the small print, and you will find cases where they actually state that the Contras, or the resistance, as they're called by the party line press, the Contras attacking Nicaragua, which the Times and so on calls the resistance, that they will not succeed in overthrowing the government, but they will, I'm virtually quoting, succeed in forcing the government to divert its resources towards defense and away from social reform. And that's the primary concern. We've got to make sure that they don't carry out what Oxfam called the threat of a good example. And that has been and that's correct. That's a correct analysis. The U.S., it's wrong to think that Nicaragua was no threat to the United States. It's a major threat. As soon as they began developing substantial improvement in health programs, clinics, great growth in literacy, diversion of resources to production of subsistence crops instead of export crops and so on, that rang the alarm bells in Washington, because that's the threat of a good example. When Oxfam, charitable development agency, says that the Nicaraguan government is unique among 76 developing countries in the commitment of the government to the development process